Okay, so let's see, we're in chapter 9, homework. I'm going to pull up the one with the answer key so that way I don't have to calculate. What question number is it, Barbara? 10.
The last part, I had the last part 10, like where we start doing adjusting.
10, like
B.
Oh wait, I'm on chapter 9. That's why I'm like, what?
Yeah, it was,
My brain's on chapter 9.
I got most of the B part. It was when we got to the adjusting part on December 31st, bad debt expense and allowance for doubtful accounts.
Yeah.
Get that.
So that one's kind of tricky, right? Okay, so we're in chapter 8, homework number 10. So my numbers are different. All of your numbers will be different, but we can kind of go over it. So this is exercise 8-14, just so you kind of know. So this one was a really long one, and if you've worked on it, I know I helped a couple of you just kind of explaining where they're getting that adjusting amount at the end. So I think this first part was okay, right? Like you're on the first one, you were doing direct write-off, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So that one was pretty straightforward. And then they give you this aging schedule. And then they want you, in part A, again, you're doing direct write-off, which I think is pretty clear. But then under part B, it wants you to take that same information and journalize transactions under the allowance method. So under allowance method, again, we're using that aging of accounts receivables, that aging schedule that they provided us. And one of the key things in this one is we have to consider that balance and allowance for doubtful accounts, okay? So the tricky part, though, is that the balance changes as you go through the problem, okay? So like on part B on mine, it says allowance for doubtful accounts has a beginning balance of $11,400. I don't know where my black marker is. Oh, there it is. Hiding. So we have our allowance for doubtful accounts. So remember, it's a contra asset account, so technically it increases on the credit side. Well, they didn't tell me if it was a debit or credit balance, so I'm going to assume it's the normal credit balance, okay? So this was my balance before the month of June, or at the beginning of the year. And so then it wanted you to journalize the transactions that it provided. So just to kind of go over those very briefly, let's see. June 8th, we wrote off Kathy Quantel's account. Well, you can still, if you remember, under the allowance method, we can still do write-offs of accounts. It just looks a little different, okay? So we wrote off Kathy Quantel's account under the allowance method. Scroll a lot. So in that case, we debited allowance for doubtful accounts, $3,800, and that was June 8th, okay? And then we credited her account. So again, as a reminder, under allowance method, at the end of the year, you're doing an adjustment estimating how much you think is going to be uncollectible the whole year, the whole next year, really. And so at this point, we're into the next year, and we determined out of the whole, you know, 11,400 that we deemed uncollectible, 3,800 of that is Kathy. Okay, so now we're just identifying specific people that aren't going to pay. So that was that first journal entry. And then on the 14th, we received $2,700 as partial payment on the $6,800 account of Rosalie Oakes. And then it's kind of cut off, but we wrote off the remaining balance. So Rosalie Oakes owed us $6,800. She paid us $2,700, and then I guess she told us to never contact her again. She was running into Mexico or something. So we're going to write off the remainder. So on the 14th, we debited cash for the money. She did pay us. She did pay us some. And then we wrote off the remainder. So the remainder amount, so 6,800 minus 2,700, she still owes us 4,100 that we're writing off. So we have another debit of 4,100 on August 14th. Okay. And then we credited her whole account because, you know, she paid 2,700 cash, the remaining 4,100 we're not going to assume. We're going to assume she's not paying us. Okay. And then I can kind of tell by the next two entries what happened there. So I don't have to scroll back and forth. So on October 16th, Kathy Quantel calls up and says, hey, I got your payment, you know, but we wrote her off right here, right? So then under the allowance method, we need to reinstate her account and then show that she paid it. Okay, so what we do is basically in this first, when we reinstate it, notice it's just a reversing entry. So we debited her account just for records purposes, and we credited allowance for doubtful accounts, 3,800. Which, if you really think about it, we just canceled that out, right? So you could really just kind of be like, okay. I mean, it's there, it's happening, but those two cancel each other out, okay? So we reinstated it, and then we received her payment. So on the collection part, that's just a typical cash is increasing, her accounts receivable is being credited to show she paid. So again, the only reason we debited her account here is for record keeping, so then we can show that she paid. Okay, so it looks like, well, why wouldn't you just debit cash and credit allowance for doubtful accounts, right? Because, but again, in accounting, we need to keep proper records. And so really the whole point of reinstating her account and then crediting it is to show what happened. Because otherwise we would say, well, where did that 3,800 cash come from? And you get audited and they're going to be like, where did that come from? And you're going to have to go through and find the canceled check or whatever, the deposit slip, you know. So it's important. That's why we do that there. It seems redundant, but that's why you do it. Okay. So that's so far. And then let's see. On the 31st of December, we wrote off the following accounts as uncollectible. So we had 5 accounts that we wrote off at the end of the year. Man, they really wanted to do them at the end there, didn't they? Okay. So as you can see, we had to credit each of those accounts receivables to write them off under the allowance method. So we just added up the total amount to debit to allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay, so that's where they get that. So that was all the transactions, you know, until that adjusting entry. So those were all the write-offs we had using the allowance method. At that point, what I recommend you doing is balancing this account. Okay, because you need to know before you do your adjusting entry for estimating, uncollectibles, you need to know what's in this, right? Under allowance method, you have to adjust with this and take this into account. So again, to me, when you're going through this type of problem, it helps to keep a T account or keep a record so you can see what's happening. And then, let's see, it looks like I'm still going to have a credit balance, right? I don't know where calculators come from. Sweet. If you ever need a calculator, got a couple extra here. Okay. On a side note, right? Sorry about the break thing. Sorry. So 11,400 minus 4,100 minus 6,340. 960. Is that what you guys got?
Yeah, all the numbers.
Yeah, I do have different numbers, but based on my numbers, I hope that's correct. Okay. Yeah, I know we all have different numbers because the homework problem is algorithmic. That was a journal entry we did here. So anytime I debited or credited allowance for doubtful accounts, I put it over here. And again, you could, add that in and then subtract it out, but those two just cancel each other out.
But you've got that,
She took the credit and then
11,000
subtracted the debits, and that's what you.
Yes, yeah, I got the 11,400 from what they told me. They told me I had a beginning balance of 11,400. And then I would go in and put in all my debits and credits throughout the year. And then I would rebalance. Okay, so before I do my adjustment, allowance for doubtful accounts has an existing credit balance of 960. So I think that's the different part. And then once you do that, you're really just doing your adjusting entry at that point. It's just different, right? We didn't do any where you had to actually go through and balance that account first. Usually they would just tell you allowance for doubtful accounts has a beginning credit balance of 960. This is the balance before adjustment. Okay, so balance before adjustment. Okay, and we're used to them giving us that.
Okay.
But this time you had to calculate it. Okay. So from there, really, again, the next step is just doing your adjusting entry. So you would look at, you know, here's the aging of accounts receivable. Did they give us anything? So you would need to calculate, you know, how much you estimated as unreceivable. So I would have to go through and take, you know, 1% of 182,000, 9% of 68,000. You remember doing all of that, right? We did it in a different homework problem too. Do it. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Never mind.
Okay.
I'll just wait.
Okay, sorry. So you're going to do all of your percentages and add up your total estimate, which hopefully they give me so I don't have to do it. Let's see. Yeah, I'm like, here it is. Scroll over. So they've, you know, done the aging for me. So my total estimated doubtful accounts is 25,840. So remember, when I get that number, that's what I want my ending balance to be. I want my balance to be 25,840. Okay? When I do my aging, my goal is to find this balance. Right? So then, on mine, to find my adjustment amount, what I need to do is I need to find, I'm looking for what I need to adjust right here. When I have a 960 balance before adjustment, I know my ending balance needs to be 25,840. So what would I adjust? Well, it's kind of on the board, right? So how would I calculate that? How did they get the 24,880? They subtracted, right? So remember, when your allowance for doubtful accounts has a credit balance before adjustment, you take your goal balance minus that credit. And that's where they're getting the adjustment amount of 24,880. If that 960 had been a debit, you would add to get that adjustment. Okay. So the first step is always calculating your total estimate, which is your ending balance. And then if you have an existing credit, you subtract to get your adjustment. If it were a debit balance, you would add to get that adjustment. So again, that's the adjusting entry at the end of the year. So we're saying of all the accounts receivable that's still owed to us, we think 25,840 is uncollectible. And in order to get that, we already have 960 in there, so we have to subtract. Okay. Any questions on that one? Does that help some?
Yes, it helps.
Duet, did somebody else? Is there a part C?
Yeah.
Well, dang it. I'm just kidding. How much higher or lower would Rustic Table's net income have been under the direct write-off method than under the allowance method? Okay, so on that one, well, what account affects net income? What lowers net income? Your expenses. Good. So when I look at the two methods, what I would want to look at is my bad debt expense under the two methods. Okay, so in part A, I would go through and I would need to balance my bad debt expense. So, you know, I take 3,800 plus the 4,100 minus the 3,800, which would really be 4,100 plus the 6,340. So bad debt, for me, bad debt under the direct write-off was really the 4,100 plus the 6,340, or what, 10,440. So those were the increases to bad debt expense under the direct write-off method. The good thing is under the allowance method, you only debit bad debt expense at the end. So for me, that's direct. Under allowance, my bad debt equals the 24,880. Okay. So what it's saying there in part C is under the allowance method, I accounted for a lot more bad debt, didn't I? Like 14,440 more of bad debt. Well, that's going to make my net income under the allowance method lower. Okay. So in this case, it's asking how much higher or lower would their net income have been under the direct write-off method? Well, under direct write-off method, I had less expense, so my income would be higher by that difference. So I just subtracted. Okay. So under the direct write-off method, you'll have to calculate how much bad debt expense was in the period. But then under allowance method, it's just your debit and your adjustment. And then you just subtract. Any questions on that? So that one is a little tricky. Was that the last of it, or was there more? I think that was it. Okay. Any questions? Correct. Yeah, my numbers are different. Everyone's numbers are different on the homework, but the process is the same. So we did the practice where all of our numbers matched up, but on the homework, yeah, we try to, you know, yeah. Any questions on any of that? Ooh, sorry, I just got a text burn from my son.